Hello everyone, welcome to our channel University of Political Science. Toda I discusses about Plato the Republic. The imperial ambitions of Athens perished with her defeat in the Peloponnese War, but through her role was changed, her influence upon Greece, and ultimately upon the whole of the ancient world, was by no means diminished. After the loss of her empire, she became more and more the educational center of the Mediterranean world, a position which she retained even after her political independence had vanished and indeed far down into the Christian era. Her schools of philosophy and science and rhetoric were the first great institutions in Europe devoted to higher education, and to the research which necessarily accompanies advanced instruction, and to them came students from Rome and all parts of the ancient world. Plato's academy was the first of the philosophical schools, though Socrates, who taught especially rhetoric and oratory, probably opened his school a few years earlier. Aristotle's school at the Lyceum was opened some 50 years later, and the two other great schools, the Epicurean and the Stoic, began some 30 years after Aristotle. Those who have mastered the fine spontaneity, both of life and of art, in the Periclean age can hardly avoid looking upon this academic specialization of Athenian genius as a decline. Probably it is true that the Greeks would not have turned to philosophy, at least in the manner they did, had the life of Athens remained as happy and as prosperous as it seemed to be when Pericles' funeral oration struck its dominant note. And yet no one can doubt that the teaching of the Athenian schools played as large a part in European civilization as the art of the 5th century. For these schools marked the beginning of European philosophy, especially in its relations with politics and other social studies. In this field, the writings of Plato and Aristotle were the first great pioneering operations of the European intellect. At the start, they have only rudimentary beginnings and nothing that can properly be called a body of sciences, distinguished and classified in the way that now seems obvious. The subjects and their interrelations were in process of creation. But by the time the corpus of Aristotelian writings was completed in 323, the general outline of knowledge into philosophy, natural science, the sciences of human conduct, and the criticism of art was fixed in a form that is recognizable for any later age of European thought. Certainly, no scholar can afford to belittle the advancing specialization and the higher standard of professional accuracy which came with the schools, even though it brought something academic and remote from civic activity. The need for political science. Plato was born about 427 BC of an eminent Athenian family. Many commentators have attributed his critical attitude toward democracy to his aristocratic birth, and it is a fact that one of his relatives was prominently connected with the oligarchic revolt of 404. But the fact can be perfectly well explained otherwise. His distrust of democracy was no greater than Aristotle's, who was not noble by birth nor even Athenian. The outstanding fact of Plato's intellectual development was his association as a young man with Socrates, and from Socrates, he derived what was always the controlling thought of his political philosophy, the idea that virtue is knowledge. Otherwise stated, this meant the belief that there is objectively a good life, both for individuals and for states, which may be made the object of study, which may be defined by methodical intellectual processes, and which may therefore be intelligently pursued. This in itself explains why Plato must in some sense be an aristocrat, since the standard of scholarly attainment can never be left to numbers or popular opinion. Coming to manhood at the conclusion of the Peloponnese War, he could hardly be expected to share Pericles' enthusiasm for the happy versatility of democratic life. His earliest thought on politics, that recorded in the Republic, fell just at the time when an Athenian was most likely to be impressed by the discipline of Sparta, and before the hollowness of that discipline was made evident by the disastrous history of the Spartan Empire. In the autobiography attached to the 7th letter, Plato tells how, as a young man, he had hoped for a political career, and had even expected that the aristocratic revolt of the 404 BC would bring substantial reforms in which he might bear a part. But experience with oligarchy soon made democracy seem like a golden age, though forthwith the restored democracy proved its unfitness by the execution of Socrates. The result was that I, who had at first been full of eagerness for a public career, as gazed upon the whirlpool of public life, and saw the incessant movement of shifting currents, at last, felt dizzy and finally saw clearly in regard to all states now existing that without exception their system of government is bad. Their constitutions are almost beyond redemption, except through some miraculous plan accompanied by good luck. Hence was forced to say in praise of the correct philosophy, that it affords a vantage point from which we can discern in all cases what is just for communities and for individuals, and that accordingly the human race will not see better have until either the stock of those who rightly and genuinely follow philosophy acquire political authority, or else the class who have political control be led by some dispensation of providence to become real philosophers. It is exceedingly tempting to see in this passage an important reason for the founding of Plato's school, though rather curiously the school is not mentioned in the letter. The date must have been within a few years after the conclusion of his rather extensive travels, and his return to Athens in 388. Doubtless, the academy was not founded exclusively for any single purpose, and therefore it would be an exaggeration to say that Plato intended to build an institution for the scientific study of politics and the training of statesmen. Specialization had not yet reached this point, and Plato hardly thought of the need for the philosopher in politics as a need for men trained ad hoc in the professions of administration and legislation. He thought of it rather as a need for men in whom adequate intellectual training had sharpened the perception of the good life, and who were, therefore, prepared to discriminate between true and false goods, and between adequate and inadequate means of attaining the true good. The problem was an outgrowth of the distinction between nature and convention, which had been before the minds of reflective Greeks during the second half of the 5th century. It was, therefore, in Plato's conception, an important part of the general problem of discriminating true knowledge from appearance, opinion, and downright illusion. To it no branch of advanced study, such for example as logic or mathematics, was irrelevant. At the same time, it would be hard to believe that Plato, convinced as he was that such knowledge, and its acquisition by rulers was the only salvation for states, did not hope and expect that the academy would disseminate true knowledge and philosophy, not spurious arts such as rhetoric. Certainly, he believed later that statesmanship is the supreme or kingly science. In 367 and 361, Plato made his famous journeys to Syracuse to aid his friend Dion in the education and guidance of the young king Dionysius, in whose accession he saw what he hoped was the auspicious occasion for a radical political reform, a youthful ruler with unlimited power and a willingness to profit by the combined advice of a scholar and of an experienced statesman. The story is told with great vividness in the 7th letter. Plato soon found that he had been wholly misled by the report of Dionysius's willingness to take advice, and to apply himself either to study or to business. The project was a complete failure, and yet it does not appear that there was anything essentially visionary about Plato's purposes. The advice contained in his letters to Dion's followers is sound and moderate, and it seems clear that Dion's plans were wrecked by his own failure to meet the Syracuses with a conciliatory policy. Some parts of Plato's 7th letter imply that he perceived the great importance for the whole Greek world of a strong Greek power in Sicily to offset the Carthaginians, which was certainly a statesmanlike project, and if he believed that an adequate power was impossible without monarchy, this was a conclusion which the Hellenization of the East by Alexander did much to justify. So far as the Sicilian adventure concerned Plato personally, he manifestly felt that no serious scholar who, for a generation, had been preaching the doctrine that politics required philosophy could refuse the support which Dion asked. I fear to see myself at last altogether nothing but words, so to speak, a man who would never willingly lay hand to any concrete task. Matters more or less connected with political philosophy are discussed in many of Plato's dialogues, but there are 3 which deal mainly with the subject, and from these, his theories must be mainly gathered. These are the Republic, the Statesman, and the Laws. The Republic was written in Plato's mature, but comparatively early manhood, probably within a decade of the opening of his school. Though it was certainly intended to be a unit, and has so impressed its best critics, its composition may well have extended over several years, and there is good stylistic evidence that the discussion of justice in book is relatively early. The Laws, on the other hand, was the work of Plato's old age, and according to the tradition, he was still at work on it when he died in 347. 30 years, or possibly even more, elapsed, therefore, between the writing of the Republic and the writing of the Laws. It is plausible to see in the former work the enthusiasm of Plato's first maturity, of the time which saw the founding of the school, and in the latter the disillusionment which came with age, perhaps accentuated by the failure of his venture in Syracuse. The Statesman was written between the other two dialogues, but probably nearer the Laws than the Republic. Virtue is knowledge. The Republic is a book that defies classification. It fits into none of the categories either of modern social studies or of modern science. In it, practically every side of Plato's philosophy is touched upon or developed, and its range of subject matter is such that it may be said to deal with the whole of human life. It has to do with the good man and the good life, which for Plato connoted life in a good state, and with the means for knowing what these are and for attaining them. And to a problem so general no side of individual or social activity is alien. Hence the Republic is not a treatise of any sort, nor does it belong to politics, or ethics, or economics, or psychology, though it includes all these and more, for art and education and philosophy are not excluded. For this breadth of subject matter, which is a little disconcerting to an academically trained reader, several facts account. The mere literary mechanics of the dialogue form which Plato used permitted inclusiveness and freedom of arrangement which a treatise could not tolerate. Moreover, when Plato wrote, the various sciences mentioned above did not yet have the distinctness that was later somewhat artificially assigned to them. But more important than either literary or scientific technique is the fact to which reference has already been made, that in the city-state life itself was not classified and subdivided so much as it now is. Since all of a man's activities were pretty intimately connected with his citizenship, since his religion was the religion of the state, and his art very largely a civic art, there could be no very sharp separation of these questions. The good man must be a good citizen. A good man could hardly exist except in a good state, and it would be idle to discuss what was good for the man without considering also what was good for the city. For this reason, an interweaving of psychological and social questions, of ethical and political considerations, was intrinsic to what Plato was trying to do. The richness and variety of the problems and subject matter that figure in the Republic did not prevent the political theory contained in the work from being highly unified and rather simple in its logical structure. The main positions developed, and those most characteristic of Plato, may be reduced to a few propositions, and all these propositions were not only dominated by a single point of view, but were deduced pretty rigorously by a process of abstract reasoning which was not, indeed, divorced from the observation of actual institutions, but did not profess to depend upon it. To this statement, the classification of forms of government in Books 8 and 9 is in some degree an exception, but the discussion of actual states was introduced to point the contrast with the ideal state, and may therefore be neglected in considering the central argument of the Republic. Aside from this, the theory of the state is developed in a closely concatenated line of thought which is both unified and simple. Indeed, it is necessary to insist that this theory is far too much dominated by a single idea and far too simple to do justice to Plato's subject, the political life of the city-state. This explains why he felt obliged to formulate a second theory without however admitting the unsoundness of the first, and also why the greatest of his students, Aristotle, while accepting some of the most general conclusions of the Republic, stood much closer on the whole to the form of political philosophy developed in the Statesman and the Laws than to the ideal state of the Republic. The oversimplification of the political theory contained in the earlier work made it, except in respect of very general principles, an episode in the development of the subject. The fundamental idea of the Republic came to Plato in the form of his master's doctrine that virtue is knowledge. His own unhappy political experience reinforced the idea and crystallized it in the founding of the Academy to inculcate the spirit of true knowledge as the foundation for philosophic statecraft. But the proposition that virtue knowledge implies that there is an objective good to be known, and that it can in fact be known by rational or logical investigation rather than by intuition, guesswork, or luck. The good is objectively real, whatever anybody thinks about it, and it ought to be realized not because men want it, but because it is good. In other words, we'll come into the matter only secondarily. What men want depends upon how much they see of the good, but nothing is good merely because they want it. From this, it follows that the man who knows the philosopher or scholar or scientist ought to have decisive power in government, and that it is his knowledge alone which entitles him to this. This is the belief which underlies everything else in the Republic and causes Plato to sacrifice every aspect of the state that cannot be brought under the principle of enlightened despotism. Upon examination, however, this principle is more broadly based than might at first be supposed. For it appears upon analysis that the association of man with man in society depends upon reciprocal needs, and the resulting exchange of goods and services. Consequently, the philosopher's claim to power is only a very important case of what is found wherever men live together, namely, that any cooperative enterprise depends upon everyone attending to his own part of the work. In order to see what this involves for the state, it is necessary to know what sorts of work are essential. An investigation which leads to the three classes of which the philosopher-ruler will obviously be the most important. But this dividing of tasks and securing the most perfect performance of each, the specialization of function, which is the root of society, depends upon two factors: natural aptitude and training. The first is innate and the second is a matter of experience and education. As a practical enterprise, the state depends on controlling and relating these two factors, in other words, upon getting the best human capacity and developing it by the best education. The whole analysis reinforces the initial conception: there is no hope for states unless power lies in the hands of those who know, first, what tasks the good state requires, and, second, what heredity and education will supply the citizens fitted to perform them. Plato's theory is, therefore, divisible into two main parts or theses: first, that government ought to be an art depending on exact knowledge, and, second, that society is a mutual satisfaction of needs by persons whose capacities supplement each other. Logically, the second proposition is a premise for the first. But since Plato presumably derived the first almost ready-formed from Socrates, it is reasonable to suppose that temporally the second was a generalization or extension of the first. The Socratic principle that virtue is knowledge proved to have larger applicability than appeared on its face. More informations, please visit our website www.wpoliticalscience.com. Thanks. See again to new topics.